All right, guys, can you hear me okay? Look, I'm really excited you guys are here. I'm really excited to introduce you to Rob Caskie. But one thing that I wanted to say is that there are just a lot of open chairs up here in the front. Rob does like to walk around, and he does like to call on people. So he has met Dr. Esson, he has met Dr. Smith, he's met Dr. Weber. So guys, be prepared because he's gonna involve you guys in the talk. Guys, I thank you very much for coming. In the spirit of leadership, community, and excellence, I welcome you guys to the G.V. Brindley Lectureship. This is a part of the Department of Surgery and the Baylor Scott and White Health Hospital here in Temple. The purpose here is really kind of to build community. This is why I really wanted to make sure that we invited not only our faculty in the Department of Surgery, but our faculty in other departments and across the hospital. We also invited nursing. We invited administrators. I know that we don't have a lot of people in here, but I, for one, am not discouraged because we had 300 people this morning, which is pretty exciting. And some people have families and stuff that they couldn't make it today. So I appreciate you guys coming today. And one of the things that I would ask is that if you find this very valuable, I would really love to hear from you and to hear how we can get the word out better so that we can have even more people, more of the families show up because we want to build community. Now, this has been the reestablishment of the G.V. Brindley Lectureship. Dr. Brindley was actually a vital symbol of Baylor Scott and White, of actually Scott and White, now Baylor Scott and White Health. He is a cornerstone of our history, a foundation of our department, and a beacon of our values and purpose as surgeons, as leaders, and our hospital work community. It's a privilege to welcome you to today's event, a lecture that is not just about history, but about leadership, resilience, and the incredible power of community in the face of crisis. We're here to reflect on the remarkable journey of Sir Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance Expedition, a story that's become legendary not just for the harshness of the Antarctic environment, but the extraordinary way a group of individuals, under unimaginable pressure, came together as one. At the heart of Shackleton's leadership was the unshakable belief in community, a belief that in moments of chaos and uncertainty, what holds a team together is not just orders and structures, but it's the shared values, aligned goals, and mutual trust. Shackleton did not just lead, he created a culture where every member knew that they mattered, where each role was essential and there was no one left behind. In many ways, his expedition gives us a powerful mirror for our own teams and organization today, because we too operate in complex, unpredictable environments. We too face challenges that test our endurance. Maybe not on the ice, maybe not in isolation, but certainly with pressure, uncertainty, and change. It's those moments that community matters most. When we say we have each other's backs, it's not just a slogan, it's a strategy for survival. When we build teams based on trust, respect, and sense of shared purpose, we create the conditions for people not just to survive adversity, but to rise through it together and to thrive. So as we revisit Shackleton's journey today, let's not just marvel at the heroism of the past. Let's use it as a re-image of how we lead, how we support one another, and how we build resilient communities right here in our own workforce, in our own workplace. I do want to introduce you to a colleague, a master statesman, an incredible storyteller, Rob Caskie. We actually met in Antarctica. My family did a cruise to Antarctica. It was one of the things that I really wanted to experience with my son. And during that time, we actually went to the Falkland Islands, South Georgia Island, the Antarctic Peninsula. We got to see things that were just absolutely amazing, and we got to hear some incredible tales and stories. And I thought that they were so meaningful and so relevant from medicine that I invited Rob to come and give us a story. So with a stick in hand and a storyteller's heart, I am sure that you guys are going to love the engagement, the storytelling, the message that he's going to give. Rob, thank you so much for coming. By the way, Rob did come all the way over here from South Africa. It's a pleasure to have you here in Texas. And the only thing greater than seeing Rob in his element in Antarctica is trying to see him eat a Texas-sized burger. Rob, come on up.
Thank you.
You have yours. You're on, right? All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Papa. Thank you for that introduction. And a warm welcome to all of you. I hope more than anything that you'll enjoy my story here this evening. I think we should start by saying that at the turn of the last century, Antarctica was about as foreign to the human mind as the surface of the moon. And there was this increasing clamor to try and get to Antarctica, but more particularly to the South Pole, 90 degrees south. And the British really felt that they had an almost proprietorial right to get there first. So the time we're going to be talking about is known to many as the Golden Age of Exploration, 1901 to 1916. And as a child growing up in South Africa, my parents knew something about Captain Scott of the Antarctic. It always sounded like a very tragic story. They said that someone had got there first, but the details were very unclear. And as I grew and started to read, I began to read more and more about Antarctica, and I realized that although the British celebrate Scott, they celebrate all their tragic heroes. There were many other players in this race to get to the South Pole that are equally significant, if not more so, than Robert Falcon Scott. So, having said all that, it would be fair to say that the man who we're going to talk about largely this evening, being Ernest Henry Shackleton, began his Antarctic career on board of a ship called the Discovery alongside Scott in 1901. Most of my listeners don't know that. They are aware of Shackleton's endurance expedition, for which he's best known. And many folks forget of the background, the history that these explorers had long before their moment of notoriety or their moment of prominence. Gladwell in his book talks about 10,000 hours. I was talking about it today with Dr. Papa about the work and the hours involved in the training of doctors and surgeons. 10,000 hours. Everyone thinks the Beatles suddenly burst onto the scene. And then you go and read that they used to play in a German nightclub 8 hours on, 8 hours off, 24/7, 7 days a week. Long before they were ever a household name. And most of my listeners are unaware that this man and Scott began their Antarctic careers together on board of the Discovery in 1901. Now, on that ship, Scott chose 2 men to take with him to try and pull a sled to the South Pole. Antarctica is the highest, driest, coldest, windiest continent on Earth. There are many folks, Patian, who think of a great flat sheet of ice. Do you know there are mountains there that rise up to 15,000 feet above sea level? The polar plateau on which the South Pole is situated is at 10,000 feet above sea level. Snow 2.5 miles deep, and ice. Coldest recorded temperature at a Russian base called Vostok, minus 92 centigrade. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit. Suffice to say that it is almighty cold. And flowing around it is a huge current called the circumpolar current, the largest ocean current on Earth, 1,000 times the flow of the Amazon River. And from the closest continental edge to the South Pole is a distance of about 800 miles. It's a big place. Well, Scott chose two men to take with him, trying to pull a sled in unison. We call it man-hauling, where you have traces linked to a sled and you pull a sled in unison. Now, if you ever imagine trying to test your relationship with another human being, try man-hauling. Because when you stop, the runners freeze to the ice, and you've got to jerk the sled in unison to get it moving again. If one of the party needs to relieve themselves, go to the bathroom, the whole operation stops. And as a result, these folks would eat and drink at night and tended to not eat or drink during the day because of the issues of stopping. So they would pull for 8, 9, 10 hours, continually running the risk of dehydration. Well, on that journey, they never even made it to the base of the Transantarctic Mountains that rise up to 15,000 feet above sea level. And Shackleton, who was a tough man, was overcome with scurvy. So much so that on the way back to the hut, Scott and Wilson at times had to pull him on the sled, increasing their workload exponentially. As a result, their relationship broke down irretrievably. They never enjoyed a major expedition together again. Now, before I proceed with the story, perhaps I should give you a little bit of background. Scott came from a landed family in the country, southern England, went to a good school, joined the Royal Navy, which is striated, very dictatorial, and extremely aware of your station, your rank, your position. As a result, he had the ship and the hut divided with a line of packing cases that officers ate and slept on one side of that line. The others ate and slept on the other side of that line. Shackleton left Dulwich College at age 16. He never finished school. Came from a large family. His father was a Quaker, Yorkshireman. His mother was Irish Protestant. 10 children, 8 sisters, 1 brother. And father, realizing their circumstances were pretty dire, particularly financially, studied medicine quite late in life. I respect him for the commitment. They then moved to London, where Shackleton went to Dulwich College. And when he was invited back to hand out the academic prizes, he said ruefully that it was the closest he'd ever been to the academic prizes of Dulwich because he was not a good scholar. And he joined the Merchant Navy, which was far more egalitarian, not striated and dictatorial like the Royal Navy. And as a result, their management styles of human beings, their leadership styles, and indeed their characters were very different. And after the scurvy, Shackleton was sent back to England by Scott, saying if he didn't go home as an invalid, he would go home in disgrace. And I always mention this to folks, Dan, that we need to think very carefully what we say about others, especially in this age of instant communication, because it can come back to haunt you. They never enjoyed a major expedition together again. And Shackleton, who is regarded by some authors as living life like a rushing wind, he was a dreamer. He was unorthodox. He was cavalier. He was a man who, I think, always thought of great schemes. Never so much the process, perhaps, to achieve those dreams. He decided he was going to go back to Antarctica and try and reach the South Pole off a little ship that he raised sponsorship for called the Nimrod. And he was going to attempt the impossible with the most unconventional methods. He would use petrol engine motor sledges with caterpillar-like tracks, Siberian ponies, donkeys, and then man-hauling to try and get to the pole. Man-hauling, pulling a sled together. Remember, I mentioned that. For the Norwegians, they always said, the Scandinavians, dogs, dogs, dogs. Because a good dog team and a good cross-country skier move at about the same pace. And without lowering the tone of the lecture, when a dog runs out of steam, you can feed it to its companions and the men, which means you always have fresh meat and a ready supply of vitamin C. Shackleton was going to try petrol engine motor sledges Siberian ponies, dogs, and then man-hauling. The British felt there was something vainglorious. There was something really special about getting to the pole by manpower alone. They called it the real work. Well, isn't it interesting to note that they never carried the right medication to deal with the nematode infestations as a result of dogs always eating excreta in Antarctica? It's a function of cold and hunger. And the dogs wiled away and died. The ponies performed better than the dogs. And then they had to ascend the mighty Beardmore Glacier, where the mountains rise from 2,000 to 10,000 feet in 120 miles. And ascending that glacier, a horse being led by Frank Wild, Shackleton's remarkable second in command from Yorkshire, fell into a crevasse with a sled holding most of the men's food, pulling the outer glove off his hand. Wild was left on the ice. The horse and the sled were gone. It left them in such a dire situation that the men ended up eating horse rations, trying to survive. And do you know that they got to a point where Shackleton realized they did not have enough food to get all the way to the pole and back? So they made a camp and they rushed forward, literally with emergency equipment and a day pack. No sled, no tent, to get within 100 miles of the pole. With 860 miles between their hut at Cape Ross and the pole, they'd got to within 97 miles of the pole on the 9th of January 1909. And Shackleton and his men put the Union flag in the ice and made their way back. He later wrote to his wife saying he figured she would prefer a live donkey to a dead lion. For that effort, he was knighted. He became Sir Ernest Shackleton. He was now the darling of the British public. Further south belonged to Sir Ernest Shackleton. He lectured all over Europe, Britain, America. And with that, the race took an ominous turn. They now realized you could get to the South Pole. Shackleton had proven it. So there were now 5 different nations, including the German, the Japanese, the British, racing for the pole, and dare I say it, coming in from the left flank, which the British never thought was cricket, with the Norwegians with their dogs. Now, I don't have the time here this evening to go through the race in great detail, but it would suffice to say that Amundsen got there at 3 p.m. on the 14th of December of 1911. He then sent off his Olympic quality skiers to ski north in 3 directions, putting in flags for 12 and a half miles to make sure that the British never got there next and said, you went to the right place. Do you know he started the race with 52 dogs? He returned with 7. The other 45 had been consumed along the way. Try and imagine the moment for Scott when he and his party, which was intended to be 4, and at the 11th hour he changed to 5, stumbled in upon the pole 34 days later on the 17th of January 1912. And there was the Norwegian flag, a Norwegian tent, an upturned sled, dog tracks everywhere. And Scott wrote, "Great God, this is an awful place. And to have reached it without the reward of priority, all the daydreams must go now, and we must make our way back. Can we do it?" There are authors who suggest that they died psychologically in the moment they realized they'd been beaten to the pole. And I'm sad to tell you that not one of the 5 made it back alive. So Shackleton is sitting in the wings, wondering now what is the next great opportunity and prize left for humankind. And he decided that that opportunity was going to be a crossing of Antarctica from west to east via the South Pole, a distance of around 1,800 miles, and it would involve 2 teams and 2 ships. One to go to New Zealand and set up food and fuel depots, as Shackleton, Scott, and Amundsen had done, from the continental edge towards the South Pole. The other team would go to South America and into the Weddell Sea on the western side of the continent, set up a base and take off with dogs across the continent and emerge using the food and fuel depots. I'm making this sound very simple, but that in essence is what they planned. Now I want you to imagine the issue here of trust, where you take off across the continent believing and trusting that your colleagues have laid the food and fuel depots, because if they haven't, which indeed they were unable to do all the way to the pole, you are guaranteed to die. So Shackleton bought two ships, one called the Aurora, the other called the Polaris. Now the Polaris was built in 1902 in Sandefjord, Norway, about 400 tons dry weight, considered to be the finest ice-strengthened wooden vessel of its time. It had 4-foot square oak beams crisscrossing the keel to stop it being crushed or pinched by ice. But Shackleton's family motto was, "Through endurance we conquer." So he changed the name of Polaris to Endurance, and I will refer to it as Endurance from this time onward, but be aware that those who sail say it's very poor form to change the name of a sailing vessel, and perhaps this was a portent of things to come. Shackleton had a very unconventional method of interviewing people. He said, if you want an unconventional team, you need unconventional interview methods. So he'd invite a physicist, for example, into his office on Burlington Street and say, "Can you sing?" Well, the physicist was intrigued at the question. He said, "I can shout along a little in the bath." Because Shackleton was never threatened by background, education, your qualification, your station in life, your experience. He considered cheerfulness, loyalty, optimism, and physical fortitude as the most important ideals he was looking for in men for this journey. That if things went wrong, they could pull together as a team, as a unit, and hopefully emerge alive. He always said that your number two is your most important hire, and his number two was a remarkable man who hailed from Yorkshire called Frank Wild. Now, isn't it wonderful to consider that for Shackleton, he was given permission by Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, to proceed with these plans. Somebody this morning said, it's quite unusual to have a man on the stage with a big stick talking about these things sounding rather like Churchill. Now, I've never been told that in my life. So let me say this about Winston Spencer Churchill. He must have been a rather confident young man, because he happened to be with the 17th Lancers in the Kerreri Hills at Omdurman in the Sudan on the 2nd of September of 1898, when they were faced with 55,000 dervishes under the leadership of the Khalifa, who took over after the Mahdi died. And the Lancers charged, and the dervishes lay down in depressions in the ground and let these charging horses come over them, which I think, Bob, you have to be a very brave man to do. And as the horses went over them, they'd leap up and cut their hamstrings. And then they'd deal with the riderless, or rather deal with the horseless riders. Do you know that Churchill was unsaddled that way? He fought his way clear with a revolver. Lucky enough to survive. The following year, he signed up to come out to my country as a journalist and an officer with the South African Light Horse for the Anglo-Boer War. And his mother was rightly very concerned about his safety. And he said, "Mother, have no fear. The gods would never have created so potent a being as myself for so prosaic an ending as to be killed by a Mauser bullet." Well, he was lucky, because the armored train was derailed on the 15th of November of 1899, and he was captured. And he had an epidermis that was not well suited to a Texan or a South African sun, let me tell you. He had reddish hair. He lost his hat in the derailment. And he's now walking alongside of his captors who are riding on their horses. And he took out a piece of paper from his pocket and he wrote his name on it and the date. And he gave it to his captor. He said, "Keep this, I'm going to be famous one day." Well, the Goss family, whose forebear received that note, still have it in their possession. But Winston Spencer Churchill by this time was First Lord of the Admiralty. He was the man who was responsible for that shocking Allied fiasco in the Dardanelles, but lucky enough to be young enough to recover from it. And he said to Shackleton, "Proceed." So Shackleton and his men proceeded. And Shackleton sent off Innes McIntosh, captaining the Aurora to New Zealand, whilst he took command of the newly named Endurance, and they arrived in Buenos Aires, the Paris of the South, Lonnie. When they got there, his men went off to the alehouses, and they met a young man from Wales who was intrigued by the prospect of the expedition, a young man called Percy Blackburrow. And they hid him away on board of the ship as a stowaway and waited 4 days till they felt they were far enough out that Shackleton couldn't possibly take him back. And then they presented him to Shackleton. And Shackleton summed him up pretty quickly, but had to give an air of authority and gruffness. And he said, "Stowaway, I need you to know that if something goes wrong, we eat the stowaway first." Do you know that the stowaway promptly said to him, "Sir, they'd get more off you"? Well, Shackleton and Blackburrow were great friends for the rest of the expedition. Well, when they got to South Georgia, that little island that was the headquarters of world whaling, dominated at the time by the Norwegians, they were told that the pack ice that year was the worst in living memory, and they were strongly advised to delay their departure or come back another year. And I often have listeners who challenge me on this and say, "Why on earth did Shackleton proceed?" The world was at war. He has sent off the Aurora to New Zealand. He's got the weight of the British press and the British public and the sponsors on his shoulders. How on earth do you think he could easily retract or delay the expedition? So with a heavily laden Endurance, they set off on the 5th of December of 1914, initially eastwards and then southwards from South Georgia, and ran into this pack ice 1,000 miles north of where it was anticipated. And they're burning valuable fuel, pushing the heavily laden ship down through the pack ice. Now, before we go on with our story, because most folk are very unfamiliar with this part of the world, I want to just show you on a map the story I want to try and tell you, please. So right up there at the top is the little pinprick of South Georgia. This red line represents the line of the Endurance, moving down into what's called the Weddell Sea, which sits between the Antarctic continent and this finger of land that runs up towards South America, called the Antarctic Peninsula. And because of that huge current flowing around Antarctica in a clockwise direction, it produces here a mighty gyre of water moving in a clockwise direction at a rate of 3 miles a day, 100 miles a month. Do you know that at this point, January 17, 18 of 1915, the wind changed, the temperature plummeted, and the sea froze, trapping their ship like an almond in a slab of chocolate. With that, they were left to the vagaries of the drifting ice, moving off to the northwest at a rate of 3 miles a day or 100 miles a month, and over 10 months they drifted 750 miles to this point where the ice finally crushed and destroyed the ship, sinking it to the floor of the Weddell Sea, leaving 28 men and 57 dogs floating on the sea ice. With that, Shackleton's leadership really came into the spotlight. And eventually, Shackleton and 5 companions would sail a lifeboat 750 miles from Elephant Island all the way back to South Georgia to try and get help from the whalers. Now, before I continue with the story, it would be fair to say that this is considered the greatest survival story of the modern age. It's also considered to be one of the greatest leadership tales we'll ever know. And it certainly is a triumph of the human spirit and indeed a tremendous example of the power of human beings when their back is to the wall. They have no other option, and the power of community, with Shackleton saying we will stick together, and absolutely adamant that he would get them out of it alive. Well, isn't it interesting to note, as I mentioned on the map, that on the night of the 17th of January 1915, the wind changed, the temperature plummeted, and the ship was frozen in. 2 weeks later, an open lead developed, an open channel of water about 400 yards out in front of the ship. And these desperate men tried with pickaxes and saws and crowbars to cut a channel to that open water. It was futile. The sea refroze, and Shackleton realized that his ship was now going to have to be a winter station. Winter in Antarctica, 4 months of complete darkness. More people take their lives in polar winters than at any other time or place on Earth. 4 months of complete darkness. So Shackleton changed the routine, and they continued on a Saturday night to have a sing-along with their beloved gramophone. It became a very important possession, music and song. Interesting to note that at the end of the evening, remember these are tough seamen, they had a toast, and the toast always was to wives and sweethearts, may they never meet. Here they are continuing with their scientific experiments. On this side, you can see Perce Blackburrow, the stowaway, bringing in a large lump of ice for fresh water. And over here we've got Leonard Hussey, one of the surgeons, playing chess with an Australian called Frank Hurley, who had in a previous life been a tinsmith. Imagine how useful that would be when the ship sank and they had recovered metal and steel off the ship that he could fashion into emergency stoves for the onward journey, the big stove on the ship being completely unsuitable to be taken off and moved with him on the ice. Well, on the 21st of June of 1915, midwinter's day, Hurley got his mates to put 20 flashlights out on the ice, skinning their shins badly, stumbling around in the pitch darkness to take this shot, which is considered to be one of the most iconic of the entire expedition. Look at the frost and the rime and the rigging of this ship completely beset in the ice. Well, winter becomes spring. It always happens all around the world, and with that, millions of tons of ice begin to move. Shackleton, in his book written about this expedition called South, does a drawing with a ship with a huge ice floe coming in on the bow, another coming in on the stern, and a third coming in from the other side midships, bending that famous ship like a bow. Well, even for this famous vessel, at the end of October of 1915, it was too much. The ship pops out of the ice pierces the hull, water begins to pour in. The men are now obliged to abandon the ship with the dogs and set themselves up alongside of the ship. They were given a reprieve because the ice, having pierced the hull, would hold that ship in position for a full month before it finally sank, giving the men time to get everything of value off the ship. Here you see a picture of Shackleton looking over the side, some of the lifeboats named after major backers in Britain still attached to the side of the ship. Well, eventually on the 27th of November of 1915, we have this picture taken by, of Frank Hurley, titled The End of the Ship Going Down. Now, for those of you who may have any interest in marine wrecks, it sank in 10,000 feet of water. And do you know that on the 5th of March of 2022, the South African expedition vessel and icebreaker SA Agulhas II, captained by a black captain from the Merchant Navy called Knowledge Bengal, were able to find this wreck? On the day, 100 years later, to the day that Shackleton was buried on South Georgia, to the day. Interesting to note that the men were now obliged to take up a position alongside of the ship. That position very quickly became unhygienic. The men were sinking up to their waists in the snow and the ice. So they moved their camp about a mile off to a place that was called Ocean Camp. Just back to our story, this is where the ship was caught in the ice. 750-mile drift, 10 months, trapped by the ice, eventually sunk. We now have a situation where the men have moved from where the ship sank to a big ice floe called Ocean Camp. You can see they're pretty well supplied still, food, equipment that they've moved off the ship. That canvas perimeter was a cooking area to keep wind off the men, and the cooking area that they could produce warm meals and hot drinks. But this situation, with a lowering morale amongst the men, Shackleton realized that they had to be given the impression that they were doing all they could to achieve their own salvation. And to do that, they were going to load the lifeboats onto sleds and pull them off across the ice in what we call man-hauling. This is man-hauling, where you are linked in traces to sleds, pulling the boats loaded with food, equipment, tent, and so forth. Well, those boats were crushing the sleds. They said that 14 dogs could pull more strongly than 17 men. Having said that, the men have come out of 4 months of winter doing nothing on the ship. Imagine their physical state. They've done no exercise really in 5 or 6 months. It was futile. And they had to settle down at a camp they called Patience Camp. Well, Patience Camp was a very trying place. Leonard Hussey was sent around with his banjo to try and maintain morale in each tent. Shackleton had to mix men with difficult, prickly personalities with the more easygoing characters and choose a suitable leader for each tent. And Shackleton always said that leadership has many penalties. One of the greatest is that of loneliness, where you as a leader have to take and make very difficult decisions and then give those affected by that decision time to grow accustomed to the decision you've made. And Shackleton decided at this point that the dogs were requiring too much attention, and most importantly, that their food would be better used by the men. So the dogs were destroyed. Now we know the British feel about their dogs. Many of those dogs had had puppies in Antarctica, and those puppies were now fully grown. Try and imagine leading your dog team off around a hummock of ice and Frank Wild being given the dreadful task of having to destroy them. And Shackleton decided now, with morale at an all-time low, that they were going to move forward again. And to do so, each man was going to reduce his personal possessions to a weight of only 2 pounds. So the men went off and dug holes in the ice and deposited gold sovereigns and watches and glass-plated family photographs and so forth. And a bully and a bosun called John Vincent decided that he was going to steal what he thought he could sell later. And he sewed those stolen goods into little pockets on his jacket. Now that is a difficult secret to keep in Antarctica. And as they try to move forward again, pulling the boats on those sleds as they'd done formerly, lighter now, Chippy McNeish, who was the carpenter, a rather dour Scotsman, and one of the older men in the party, tried to orchestrate a mutiny, saying since the ship was gone, they were no longer under Shackleton's command. And Shackleton pulled out a piece of paper that each man had signed back in mainland Britain, stating that they were under his command, whether at sea or on land, until returned to a safe port. But he said, in this time of stress and strain, I could have shot McNeish. So if you're wondering about the timeline, December 1914, they leave South Georgia. January 1915, the ship is trapped in the ice. October, she begins to be destroyed. November 1915 finally sinks. We're now in April of 1916, so it's 17 months since the men left South Georgia, when the ice begins to break up. Now that might sound like an advantage to all of you. It was not, because their lifeboats were small vessels made of wood. And because of the weight and the speed with which ice moves, they ran the continual risk of being crushed. So you'd have to put your boat into water and row, and then pull it out onto the ice. Try and imagine the physical difficulty of doing that. Pull it across the ice, back into the water, and row to the next ice. Back out onto the ice. Had to camp each night on the ice. Ice would often crack right through the camp, tipping men in their reindeer skin sleeping bags into the frigid water, and they'd have to be pulled out. Charles Green, the stridently voiced cook, became the hero at this point, always ready to provide a warm meal and a hot drink for these utterly emaciated men. Well, eventually, the ice broke up to the point that the men were forced to row for their lives. Do you know that they would row constantly for 108 hours, 4.5 days and nights, without a warm drink or meal? 4.5 days and nights, sucking ice to slake their thirst. Most of them suffering frostbite on hands, feet, and faces. The James Caird, to its horror, Shackleton was commanding it, lost contact with the Stancomb Wills, the smallest of the 3 lifeboats. And for 12 hours, the rest of the crew thought they were gone. Miraculously, after 12 hours, they spotted the Stancomb Wills, which was then tied by rope to the James Caird, that it not happen again. And would you believe, at the very end of April of 1916, these desperate, emaciated, starving men pitched up on a little spit of land called Cape Valentine on Elephant Island. Now, if we go back to our map, let's go back there just briefly, if you will. Elephant Island is this tiny, tiny little speck of land well off the northern end of the Antarctic Peninsula. And the point I'm making to you all, ladies and gentlemen, is if Shackleton's crew had not made landfall on Elephant Island, they would have died somewhere between there and Cape Town. It was Elephant Island or broke. Back to landing on Cape Valentine. They decided that the first man who should be on land was the little stowaway who'd become a group favorite. Everyone loved him. And they lifted him out of the boat onto that rocky shingle, and he collapsed in the water. He had frostbitten feet and couldn't stand. Now, in this next photograph, here the men are pulling the boats up the beach. There's Perce Blackburrough, disconsolate, sitting on a rock. And since you're all in the remarkable discipline of medicine, at that time chloroform, they turned 2 boats upside down to make a little rudimentary operating theatre on guano, penguin droppings. They tried to warm it up, burning seal and penguin blubber, boiled some instruments in water to try and clean them, and then dropped chloroform on a cloth held over his nose, knowing that too much you stop his heart and lungs, too little you don't anesthetize him. Read the report of a surgeon called Alexander Macklin as they cut off those frostbitten toes and they drop into a little enamel bowl. They say frostbite doesn't hurt until it starts to defrost. If you're interested, read on in those reports about the boils and the carbuncles and the sores that they had to lance and drain, and the issues with teeth falling out and rotting gums. Well, this beach that they first landed on was not safe, so Shackleton got his senior men to find a more suitable place, if you can deem it that, on the northern side of Elephant Island, facing the Southern Ocean. Now, I'm alarmed to tell you that Shackleton would decide to sail a lifeboat called the James Caird to try and get back to South Georgia for assistance from the whalers, with the second Antarctic winter approaching. So he told the mutineered Chippy McNeish, the 45-year-old carpenter, to lift the gunwales of this little lifeboat 18 inches to make her more seaworthy, to put on a second mast from the Dudley Docker, to cover the deck with canvas and timber to make her less likely to be swamped, and then put in 1.5 tons of ballast in old blanket bags in the base to make them more seaworthy. And I've always been intrigued that Shackleton would tell the most truculent of them all, the mutineer McNeish, I need you to do this work. We are going to attempt to sail nearly 800 miles to South Georgia in a boat that's 19 feet long and 6.5 feet wide. And you, McNeish, are coming with us. He was going to take McNeish and Vincent, the thief, wouldn't leave them to create discord amongst the younger men left in the hand of Frank Wild on Elephant Island. He also took the ship's captain, Frank Worsley, who was a New Zealander, uncanny ability with navigation. And they knew that they needed him and his navigation if they were to make it to South Georgia. If they missed it by 3 miles east or west, the current and the wind might preclude them getting back to the island. He took with him a strong man from Ireland called Tom Crean. And the last was a man called Tim McCarthy, came from the Hebrides, great oarsman and sailor. Now back to the previous photograph. This is how 22 men were forced to live on Elephant Island. 2 boats turned up on little lines of rock and ice with a skirting of canvas. They would eventually put in a little chimney to try and expunge the bad air. Because when you burn penguin and seal blubber, it creates a black, acrid, oily covering that covered the men to such a point that they had to walk right up to one another to recognize who the other was. They drew straws in the evening to select who was going to sleep on the benches and who would sleep in the penguin guano. When their emergency rations were gone and all the meat that they'd able to secure through penguins and seals, remember in the winter penguins and seals move off. They need open water. These men were forced to eat seaweed and kelp. And Shackleton said to Wild, if I'm not back in 3 months, you consider us dead and make the best plan you can for the men. Now, these are the Allardyce Mountains, named after the Surveyor General of India, who at one time worked in the Falkland Islands, considered to be the most intractable mountain range on earth. Not user-friendly in any way. They bisect South Georgia. And these mountains, Shackleton would have to cross because he'd come up with the wind and the current from Antarctica. And all the whaling stations, for obvious reason, Bob, are on the other side of the island where it is marginally more temperate and protected from the weather. Shackleton was hoping for a break in the weather to make the 21-mile march from where they had landed on South Georgia to the other side to get to this mountain, this whaling station called Stromness. They had no sled, no tent, no climbing equipment. Do you know they undid brass screws from the James Caird, screwed them through their boots to give them some traction? Hoping for a break in the weather, carrying 50 feet of climbing rope, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean would set off across these mountains, praying to make it before the weather killed them, leaving Tim McCarthy, poor man, to look after McNeish and Vincent, who said they could go no further. They had completely abdicated any responsibility to move further by land or by boat. And I think this was partly why Shackleton denied both the Polar Medal, and their families still carry the slight to this day. Well, do you know that when Shackleton and his 2 companions walked into the whaling station in May of 1916 at Stromness, children bolted from the view of them. And Shackleton went to the whaling captain, a tough Norwegian called Soiler, who knew Shackleton well. Shackleton was not recognized, and he extended his hand and said, Ernest Shackleton. And that tough Norwegian whaler cried. Shackleton said, is the war over? And the Norwegian said, the war is not over. The world has gone mad, and thousands of men are dying in the trenches of France. Do you know, as if the story has not held enough drama and misadventure already, Shackleton made 3 attempts to get back to Elephant Island 3. On one, he was thwarted only 5 miles from the island by sea ice. And eventually, with a little vessel called the Yelko, loaned to him by the Chilean government, with a captain called Louis Pardo. They managed to get back to Elephant Island. Remember 3 months? Consider us dead. It was the 30th of August of 1916, 4 months and 1 week after leaving the men. Frank Wild every day had encouraged them, saying, pack your belongings, send a man up the cliff to build a little fire with old cloth and blubber to attract attention, saying the boss, as Shackleton was warmly known to all, might be back for us today. Do you know, 4 months and 1 week after leaving them, Shackleton was finally able to get back to Elephant Island to rescue the men. And imagine him standing on the edge of the ship and shouting, Wild, are you well? And Wild shouted back, I'm well, sir. We are all well. Do you know they hadn't lost a man? How many of you know that when they got back to England, their return completely overshadowed by what was going on in France? Many were spat at in the streets, saying, you were having a jolly down on the ice while your comrades are dying in the trenches of France. 2 of Shackleton's men who survived this were dead within 3 months in the trenches. I've included this for some of the lessons that are to be extracted from this incredible story that I don't intend to go through. I'm hoping that Colleen may share it with you. But there are some wonderful, wonderful pieces that emerge from the story that come out of all this that one, I think, can use in your daily lives and in your leadership positions. I particularly like the last one about going for broke when the options narrow, congratulating yourselves and others for jobs well done, letting one's staff inspire you and make sure that the jobs are completed. Now, when you read about polar exploration all over the world, you will often read about poisoning and murder, about mutiny and cannibalism and suicide and post-traumatic stress. Have you heard me mention any of that outside of the carpenter attempting to create a mutiny? Do you know that Shackleton, who had created a lovely little term saying, those white voices keep calling me back, referring to the magnetism and the allure of Antarctica. And having been there a number of times, I can tell you it's a very compelling, beguiling place. He asked for volunteers from his old guard to join him on a ship going back to Antarctica called the Quest in 1921. And would you believe many of the men who'd survived this said, boss, we'll join you. What a testimony to his leadership, to his charisma, and to the way he'd led them through thick and thin and got them all back alive. And do you know, on the 4th of January of 1922, Shackleton, who was 47, wasn't feeling very good. He consulted with his surgeon, Macklin. Macklin could sadly do nothing for him, and Shackleton never made the dawn. He died of a massive heart attack on the 5th of January of 1922. Congenital asthmatic, had a heart condition, had smoked all his life, had drunk all his life, had the issues with scurvy on the Discovery, dysentery and scurvy on the Nimrod, then all the deprivations of the journey on the Endurance. Finally, his heart had given in. His body was embalmed and prepared for a journey back to England. And when they got to Buenos Aires, his wife was contacted by telegraph. And Emily Dorman sent back a simple message saying, Antarctica always was his mistress. Bury him there. So Shackleton was taken back to South Georgia for burial, where he's buried at Grytviken in the whalers' graveyard. This is his grave with a huge granite gravestone at its base. I hope you will recall perhaps that Shackleton loved poetry. When the sailors used to get off the boats in the ports when he was in the merchant navy, Shackleton would often stay on board, his father having warned him about the dangers of the cities and particularly that of drinking, and he would read poetry. And one of his favorite poets was a man called Robert Browning, Scottish poet. And on the back of this great gravestone is a stanza from one of Robert Browning's poems. And the words read, I hold that a man should strive to the uttermost for his life's set prize. Now, with the history of this magnificent facility and the community of the railroad upon which it was founded, and how Dr. Papa and others strive to improve the sense of community and the sense of family within this wonderful community you find yourselves in. I've changed that stanza a little, and I say, I hold that a man or a woman should strive to the uttermost for their life's set prize. And as you in your leadership positions and the very important positions you fill in this community, with peers, with subordinates, with patients, with families, if you remember one thing from the little story I've told you here tonight, be it this, please, that you strive to the uttermost for your life's set prize. Thank you all very much.
That was absolutely fantastic. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. I think that there's an opportunity for questions and maybe a little bit more one-on-one. I actually have one question. So you actually said that there were two ships. One was a support ship that went to New Zealand, and they left all the supplies for Shackleton. What happened to those guys?
The story of the Aurora and Captain Enos McIntosh, unfortunately, is not one that ends well like Shackleton's. The Aurora at one time in a storm broke its ice anchors and drifted off to sea and was found drifting in the sea between Antarctica and New Zealand, was towed back to New Zealand and in due course towed back to Antarctica. Enos McIntosh in the interim, when they were offloading the ship, had a cable with a big hook on the end of it used for offloading the ship, swing and remove one eye. And do you know, in those circumstances, he stayed on in charge of his duty to try and lay the food and fuel depots. They were unable to lay the food and fuel depots all the way to the pole. Enos McIntosh and two other men died. McIntosh fell through the ice and drowned. Two other men were walking on a particularly steep slope with a cliff drop off into the sea and slipped off it and disappeared into the sea without a trace. So when they say Shackleton never lost a man, that essentially is to do with his party on the Weddell Sea side. The Ross Sea party did not fare nearly as well. And back to the issue of trust, if Shackleton and his men had made it all the way to the South Pole, the food and fuel depots anticipated were not waiting for them. There's a remarkable book written about it called Shackleton's Forgotten Men by a man called Bo Riffenberg. And that book tells a harrowing story about how it was in the extreme climatic conditions of the Ross Sea, trying to set up a base and set up the food and fuel depots. So that, in a nutshell, is what happened to those men. Did not end well for them at all. 3 lives lost. Any other points or comments?
Can you go back to your map for a second?
With pleasure.
I just want to understand, are we seeing the South Pole on that map, or is it below? So where is the South Pole on that map?
The South Pole is not on this map. It's an interesting question you pose. Antarctica is the 7th biggest continent on Earth and doubles every year on account of the sea ice, the pack ice, and then reduces in spring and summer as the pack ice melts and is dispersed by current. The South Pole is not even nearly visible on this map. From this corner of Antarctica, if you can call it a corner, let's call it the northwest corner of Antarctica, to the South Pole is a distance of roughly 1,300 miles. An awfully long way. From the Ross Sea, which you access from New Zealand, from the continental edge, where Amundsen set up his base on the Ross Ice Shelf, to the South Pole is about 820 miles. So a good 500 miles closer, which is why the sled attempts were made from that quarter. But the South Pole is nowhere nearly visible on this map. if we look at the scale here, the scale in terms of 600 miles, you need twice that from this point to get to the South Pole in terms of a frame of reference. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So yes, this is a long, long way from the South Pole. When we go to Antarctica, we always tell guests that this Antarctic peninsula that we visit is effectively the Caribbean of Antarctica. Because they look at the weather app and they see temperatures of Antarctic bases at minus 40 and minus 50. Those on the polar plateau at 10,000 feet. When we go into the peninsula, they are around freezing, a bit above, sometimes a bit below, depending on the wind, but very comfortable by Antarctic standards. And certainly, I've had many guests in Antarctica who hail from Wisconsin and Minnesota and places like that, and the temperatures back home for them are much colder than where we are in Antarctica. What else did you want to ask?
I want to ask about the, now the size of, we hear about the poles shrinking. So compared now to 100 years ago.
Whoa. So comparing Antarctica now to 100 years ago, you will not believe the amount of ice that has melted, the glaciers that have receded, and the difference in the landscape as a result. I work with many colleagues who have been doing the work that we do for 40 years. I've only been doing it for 14. But you want to look at their photographs in 40 years, never mind 100, of places that we visit regularly, of how the glaciers have receded and how the ice depth has reduced. Having said that, because of the Antarctic, the circumpolar current that flows around Antarctica, it effectively insulates a weather system that keeps Antarctica much colder than the Arctic. So when we talk about global warming, which is a real issue, and ice deterioration, in the Arctic it is infinitely more accentuated because the Arctic is a small ocean surrounded by continents which are industrialized. So the rise in temperature in the Arctic, along with the Gulf Stream, is considerably higher than it is in Antarctica. But don't misinterpret me, please. The global warming and the issue of ice melting and ice degradation here is still very significant. Very significant. And these big ice shelves carve regularly. Now, carving is normally just on the edge of the ice shelf and glaciers where ice is falling into the water. There are carvings recently. One of the carvings, the size of the iceberg that drifted off was half the size of Wales, considerably larger than New York and Rhode Island. And then that eventually starts to break up too. Now, 100 years ago, carvings like that were unheard of. 40 years ago at Palmer Station, when the glaciers carved, you could hear it cracking. Everyone would jump up and run to their windows of the offices to see the carving. It was that significant. Now it's probably 4 times an hour. So from once a day to 4 times an hour, 100 times a day. It's a huge difference. So nobody even reacts now when there's a carving at Palmer Station because it's happening 4 times an hour. What other questions are there?
And one more, Rob. Between 1916, when Shackleton was rescued, and 1922, when he died, did he have any explorations, any events of heroism? What did he do during those 6 years?
No, Shackleton, during those 6 years, tried a number of things back in England, including being a politician. But he did no exploration until he had this trip planned for some geographic exploration. I personally believe that Shackleton knew his time had come and he was going back to the White Continent to die. But there was no exploration between 1916 and 1921, no. Yes, sir.
On your initial slide, there appeared to be the heads of multiple walking sticks, and I wondered what the significance of that slide was.
Okay, so I collect sticks, And I have collected sticks since I was a teenager. And that first slide is, in fact, an AI-generated slide that someone who does some IT for us created for me. Here I'm standing with one of my stick boards. I've got a large collection of sticks at home. And Dr. Papa and Colleen conspired to have a stick beautifully created for me by Darren, Colleen's husband, which was presented to me this morning. So I have a stick in my logo. I've never told a story in history without a stick. But more importantly, because I come from a South African background, we have the Nguni people who came down the east coast of Africa 1,500 years ago, who always carry a stick customarily to protect themselves from animals or people who may have ill intent. And when they have an important meeting, an Mbizo or an Ndaba, they have the talking stick that they pass around. And you may not talk unless you have possession of the stick. When I started talking on the battlefields, a stick is an incredible prop. You can use it as a spear, as a shield, as a rifle, as a border, as a river, as a window frame, anything. And speakers often wonder what to do with their hands, and the audience always pick up on it. So my crutch has always been a stick. As a result, I've never ever told a story without a stick, and I have a fairly large collection of sticks at home. This is one of 3 boards. There are 2 or 3 sticks on each set of dials running from the floor to the ceiling, and they create quite a lot of interest. So I hope that answers your question. And simply to tie in with that, the first slide was an AI-generated slide of a number of sticks, yes. Any other questions?
Rob, that was fantastic. Again, every time I hear your talks, I learn something new with every passage. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming all the way to Texas. Guys, thank you for participating, and thank you for coming and join us. Rob is going to go out to dinner with a few of you. What I had envisioned is at some point in time, as we develop this better, what I would like to do is encourage people that haven't seen each other in a while to try and get together and go to have dinner after the event. So Bob Weber actually told me that he is willing for anybody that's interested to join him for dinner because it's on him. So anyway, thank you guys. Let us know if there are any other topics that you'd like to hear. Probably sometime in the next 6 months. I'm still working on it, but I'm working on the next topic that I would like for us to present for our community rounds, and it's going to be on diplomacy. I have a one-star general that worked with Donald Rumsfeld, who is currently on the faculty at University of Chicago. He was the attaché, the military attaché to China, and was intimately involved with diplomacy on arms deals between the U.S. and China. He knows more about China and more about the politics in China than anybody I've ever met. So he'll probably be our next speaker. I'll let you know. But he is not as captivating as Rob, but he is a very good speaker as well. And I hope that we get to see you the next time around. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.